It was a typical Wednesday evening in the small suburban town of Brookwood, Texas. The sky, a blend of orange and pink, hung low in the distance as the quiet streets were alive with the usual hum of neighbors getting ready for dinner. The town had always been a place where everyone knew each other's names, where the hustle and bustle of city life felt a world away. People rarely locked their doors and nothing much happened out of the ordinary. But then, as all things in life often do, something changed. At the center of the neighborhood stood the home of Robert and Lisa Thompson, a picture-perfect couple who had been married for nearly 10 years. Robert, a well-regarded lawyer at a prestigious firm, was known for his charm and success. Lisa, his beautiful and poised wife, had once been the star of her high school dance team and still carried that grace into her adult life. They had two children, a 7-year-old son named Tommy and a 5-year-old daughter named Emily. They were the kind of family everyone envied, close-knit, loving, and seemingly flawless. However, behind the closed doors of their immaculately kept home, things were far from perfect. One late afternoon, as Lisa prepared for a family gathering, she received an unexpected visitor. It was her mother, Rachel, a woman who had long since retired from her career as a high school teacher. Rachel was a woman of commanding presence, her sharp blue eyes always seeming to pierce through anyone who met her gaze. Despite her age, Rachel carried herself with an undeniable confidence. She had been widowed for nearly 20 years and had grown incredibly close to her daughter and son-in-law over the years. Though Lisa and her mother had always shared a close bond, something unspoken simmered beneath the surface whenever Robert and Rachel interacted. Lisa could never quite put her finger on it, but she often found the way her husband looked at her mother uncomfortable. It wasn't until a fateful encounter that things began to spiral out of control. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Lisa retreated to her study to finish some work, while Rachel stayed downstairs with Robert. As time passed, the air between them became thicker. It started innocently enough, with the two chatting about old memories. But as the hours wore on, their conversation grew more personal. Unbeknownst to Lisa that night, a forbidden attraction was ignited between Robert and Rachel, an attraction that had been quietly simmering for years. What had begun as a friendly exchange escalated into something more intimate. Neither could control the magnetic pull between them, and what followed would change everything. But neither of them could have anticipated how far this dark secret would eventually take them. That same night, Lisa heard the faint sound of muffled voices from downstairs. At first, she thought nothing of it, but the tension she felt later, when she went to check on them, would haunt her forever. She paused outside the closed door, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. She had no way of knowing that in that very moment, the course of her life was about to be forever altered. When she finally opened the door, she found Robert and Rachel, standing far too close to each other. Their eyes locked for a brief second, and that's when Lisa knew something was terribly wrong. But she had no idea just how far the betrayal ran. The days after that disastrous confrontation between Robert and Lisa were long, drawn out, and full of uncomfortable silences. Lisa, though deeply hurt by Robert's confession, still didn't fully understand what had happened. She spent countless hours rethinking everything, their past, their life together, their love, trying to make sense of what had been a healthy marriage for nearly a decade. How could it all have unraveled so suddenly? And why with her mother? Robert, on the other hand, was consumed with guilt. There were no words to undo what he had done. He hadn't just cheated, he had crossed a line that, once crossed, could never be undone. The affair with Rachel had been something that slowly built over time, but once it happened, it was like a fire that quickly spiraled out of control. He had lost himself in the allure of the forbidden, in the easy comfort Rachel offered him, a comfort he thought he was missing in his marriage. But deep down, he had never wanted to hurt Lisa. He regretted the affair, regretted how it had tainted his relationship with both her and Rachel. He could not justify his actions, nor could he explain why it had gone this far. But now, after Lisa's confrontation, he had no choice but to face the harsh reality of his actions. That evening, after a long, emotionally charged conversation, Robert left the room and locked himself in the study. He needed to think, to figure out what was next. The guilt gnawed at him, but so did the fear. What would Lisa do now? Would she leave him? Could their marriage ever recover from this? Lisa, though heartbroken, still couldn't bring herself to make any drastic decisions. The truth was that she was torn. She loved Robert, despite everything. He was the father of her children, and she had always believed in the strength of their relationship. But now everything felt so fragile, like a house of cards just waiting to collapse. She could hear Robert's muffled voice from the study, though she couldn't make out the words. The tension between them was palpable, suffocating. What had once been a safe, loving home had become a place of deceit and uncertainty. After what felt like hours of staring at her reflection in the mirror, Lisa finally decided to take action. She couldn't keep living in this painful limbo. She had to confront her mother. Rachel, who had been spending the evening in the guest room after an awkward dinner, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing in Lisa's heart. Lisa found her mother sitting on the bed, flipping through a photo album. "Mom," Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper, but the gravity in it was unmistakable. Rachel looked up, her sharp blue eyes scanning her daughter's face. Lisa stood in the doorway, hands clenched by her sides, trying to steady her nerves. "Is everything all right?" Rachel asked, her tone neutral, as though nothing had changed. "Don't play innocent, Mom," Lisa shot back, her words sharp and angry. "I know what's been going on between you and Robert. How could you do this to me?" Rachel's face froze for a moment. Then a strange mixture of sadness and guilt appeared in her eyes. She put down the photo album and stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she were preparing for something inevitable. She folded her arms across her chest and sighed deeply. "Lisa, I didn't want you to find out like this," Rachel said softly, though there was no apology in her voice, just the cool composure that Lisa had always associated with her mother. "But the truth is, Robert and I have been involved. It didn't start out that way, but we found ourselves in a situation neither of us expected." Lisa felt her world shattering once again, her mother's admission twisting the knife deeper. She took a few steps into the room, her voice trembling. "How could you, Mom? You were supposed to be someone I could trust. You were supposed to be my mother, not this." Rachel didn't flinch. "I never meant to hurt you, but the way things have been between you and Robert, it was inevitable. He needed someone, and so did I." "That doesn't make it okay," Lisa yelled, feeling her rage build. "You've betrayed me in the worst way possible. You—" Her voice faltered, and she choked on the sob that threatened to escape. "You're my mother. How could you do this to me?" Rachel's face softened, but there was no remorse. "It wasn't planned, Lisa. It just happened. And now we can't undo it." Lisa could barely stand to hear anymore. She felt her body trembling with anger and hurt. She wanted to scream, to shout, to make her mother understand the depth of her pain, but instead, she turned away. She couldn't face her anymore. As she left the room, Lisa felt an overwhelming sense of defeat. Her mother and her husband, two of the people she loved most, had betrayed her in ways she could never undo. How could she go on living in a house with these secrets and lies? Meanwhile, Robert remained locked in his study, unaware of the conversation taking place just a few rooms away. He was trapped in his own guilt, too ashamed to come out and face his wife. But when he finally did, the moment had passed. Lisa was already on her way out the door, her mind made up. The days following Lisa's confrontation with Robert and Rachel were some of the most difficult of her life. The house that had once been filled with the sounds of children laughing and the soft murmur of evening conversations now felt cold and empty. Each room she passed seemed to echo with memories of a time when things were simpler, when she didn't have to question everything around her. For the first few days, Lisa stayed at her sister's house, needing distance from both her mother and her husband. Her children, who were too young to understand the gravity of the situation, sensed the tension in the air and asked questions that Lisa wasn't ready to answer. She couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth, not yet at least. How could she explain to Tommy and Emily that their father had betrayed them, that their grandmother, whom they adored, was the reason their family had fallen apart? When Lisa returned to the house a week later, it was to pack her things. She had made up her mind. Robert was no longer the man she had married, and Rachel, her own mother, had crossed a line that could never be undone. The trust between them was shattered beyond repair. As Lisa moved from room to room, gathering her personal belongings, she felt a deep sense of finality. This was the end of something that had once seemed so perfect, but she couldn't leave without confronting Robert one last time. It was late afternoon when she finally found him in the living room, staring out the window. The room was dimly lit, and the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of their past. Robert looked up as Lisa entered, and for the first time in days their eyes met without words. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do, yet it all needed to be said. "I'm leaving," Lisa said, her voice flat, devoid of the anger that had once consumed her. There was only sadness now. Robert looked at her with an expression that was part relief, part sorrow. He hadn't expected her to stay, but the reality of her leaving hit him harder than he anticipated. He had been so consumed by his own guilt, his own feelings for Rachel, that he hadn't fully grasped how much he was about to lose. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I deserve this. You deserve better. I know I've destroyed everything. He trailed off, the words too difficult to form. Lisa looked at him, her heart aching, but she couldn't allow herself to feel sorry for him anymore. "You've destroyed us, Robert. All of us. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for my mother." He didn't respond. What was there to say? Everything was already lost. Lisa moved to the door, her bags in hand, and then paused. "I want you to stay away from my mother," she added, her voice firm. "She's no longer welcome in my life, in our lives." Robert nodded silently, knowing that he had no place in her future or in her family's. With that, Lisa turned and left the house, stepping out into the cool evening air. She didn't look back. The weeks that followed were a blur. Lisa filed for divorce, a process that, though legally necessary, seemed to only deepen the wounds she had suffered. The legal proceedings were difficult, but she was determined to move forward. She had 2 children to care for, and that became her primary focus. They needed her more than ever, and she was going to make sure they had everything they needed to heal from the mess Robert and Rachel had made of their lives. But as the divorce process wore on, something strange began to happen. Robert, though devastated by the breakdown of his family, seemed to be growing closer to Rachel. Lisa had hoped that their affair would be short-lived, that the shame of their actions would pull them apart. But the opposite happened. They seemed to find solace in each other, as if their betrayal had bound them in a way that Lisa couldn't comprehend. It wasn't long before whispers of their relationship began to surface. The quiet suburban town of Brookwood didn't deal well with scandal, and soon Lisa found herself the subject of whispers and gossip. People who had once called her a friend now looked at her with pity, as if she were the one at fault. She could feel the judgment in every glance, and it made her blood boil. But it wasn't the town that Lisa needed to focus on. It was the fact that her mother and her ex-husband were still carrying on their affair. Lisa decided she couldn't sit idly by. She needed to know what was going on, and she needed answers. That's when she called Detective Jack Sullivan. Detective Sullivan had been with the Brookwood Police Department for over 15 years. A seasoned investigator, he had seen his fair share of domestic disputes, betrayals, and crimes. But the case of Robert and Rachel Thompson had piqued his interest. There was something off about it all, something that didn't sit right with him. He knew Lisa, having worked with her on a few local charity events in the past. She was strong, a good mother, and someone who didn't deserve what had happened to her family. Sitting across from Lisa in his office, Detective Sullivan listened as she explained everything. Her voice shook, but her determination was palpable. "I need you to look into my mother," Lisa said. "I need to know everything. I'm convinced she's hiding something." Sullivan nodded. "I'll see what I can do, Lisa. But I need you to understand, this isn't just about the affair anymore. Something feels off. I'll dig into Robert and Rachel, but I'll also look at everything surrounding their relationship. This might be more than just infidelity." Lisa looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "Thank you, Detective." Detective Jack Sullivan sat in his office late into the night, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him. His brow furrowed as he scanned through the documents he'd been compiling. He had spent the last few days investigating Robert and Rachel Thompson, and every step forward felt like he was getting closer to uncovering something darker than he could have imagined. At first, Sullivan had assumed the case was straightforward. A married man cheats with his wife's mother, causing heartbreak and a broken family. But the more he looked, the more the situation began to unravel in ways that didn't add up. The affair, while shocking, was not enough to explain the tension and the secrecy that surrounded Robert and Rachel. Something felt off. He had taken Lisa's request seriously, but his instincts told him there was more to this than just infidelity. It wasn't just the affair that was destroying Lisa's life. It was what was buried underneath. Sullivan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He had a hunch, but he needed hard evidence to confirm it. He reached for his phone and dialed his partner, Detective Amy Green. She was sharp, methodical, and a critical part of the team. If anyone could connect the dots, it was her. "Green," she answered, her voice as calm as ever. "Sullivan, I need you to dig into Rachel's finances. Start with the last couple of years. Look at any major deposits, wire transfers, anything unusual," Sullivan said, his tone low. "Anything in particular you're looking for?" Green asked. "There's something off about her financial situation. Rachel's not wealthy. She's a retired teacher. But I'm seeing large, unexplained sums of money coming into her accounts from an unknown source. I need you to track it down. I'm on it," Green replied. "I'll get back to you in a few hours." Sullivan clicked off the phone, feeling the weight of the case pressing in on him. His instincts told him this wasn't just a family affair gone wrong. There was something more sinister at play, something that reached beyond infidelity and hurt feelings. The following morning, Sullivan began his day with a visit to Robert Thompson's law office. He needed to speak with Robert in person to see how he responded to questions that might seem innocuous, but in fact could reveal more than he realized. Robert was one of the town's most respected lawyers, and if anyone had a motive to hide something, it was him. Sullivan entered the building and was greeted by Robert's secretary, who led him down a hallway to the office. Robert was sitting at his desk when Sullivan entered, looking every bit the successful professional he had always been known as. His well-tailored suit and the calm way he carried himself gave off an air of authority that Sullivan had never seen unravel. But Sullivan wasn't fooled. He had seen too many people like Robert, with their clean exteriors hiding the chaos underneath. "Detective," Robert greeted him with a forced smile, standing to shake his hand. "What brings you by?" Sullivan took a seat across from Robert and studied him carefully. "I've been going over the details of your case. I want to ask you a few more questions. I know this must be difficult for you, but I need your full cooperation." Robert's expression faltered for just a moment, but then he regained his composure and nodded. "Of course, anything to help." Sullivan leaned forward, his voice calm but direct. "When did you first start your relationship with Rachel?" Robert swallowed, a brief flash of discomfort crossing his face. It wasn't a sudden thing. We were close, Lisa and I became close with Rachel over the years. It started off innocent enough, but I'll admit, things got complicated." "I'm sure it did," Sullivan said, his voice barely a whisper. "But you didn't just have an affair with your wife's mother, did you, Robert?" Robert's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained control. "I don't see how that's relevant to the case." Sullivan didn't back down. "It's relevant because I'm trying to understand what's really going on. Why was it that you felt the need to cross that line? Did you know about the money, Robert?" Robert looked at him, confusion flashing in his eyes. "Money? What are you talking about?" Sullivan took out a folder from his briefcase and opened it, sliding a few documents across the desk. "These are financial statements from Rachel's bank accounts. For the last year, there's a consistent deposit of large sums of money. It's not from any legitimate source. Care to explain that?" Robert looked at the documents, his face draining of color. He seemed to swallow hard before speaking again. "I don't know anything about that. Rachel. She's been dealing with some personal things, but I didn't know about any money." Sullivan didn't believe him. "You're telling me you've been having an affair with her for months, and you didn't know she was getting money from somewhere else?" "Think harder, Robert. Did Rachel ask you for money? Did she mention anything about someone helping her?" Robert's lips pressed into a thin line as he struggled to maintain his composure. He seemed genuinely shaken. "Number, she never said anything, but maybe she's been getting help from someone else." I don't know." Sullivan studied Robert for a moment longer, watching for any signs of deception. Robert had been lying, but not entirely. There was something he wasn't telling him, something that could be the key to unlocking the entire mess. "I'll let you go for now, Robert," Sullivan said finally, standing up. "But I'll be back. I'll be keeping an eye on you." Robert didn't respond, his eyes still fixed on the documents as Sullivan left the office. He had no doubt that Robert was hiding something. But what was it? And how deep did the deception go? By the time Sullivan met with Detective Green a few hours later, she had already made some interesting discoveries. Green was seated at a small table in the local cafe, her laptop open in front of her. She looked up as Sullivan took a seat across from her. "I pulled Rachel's financial records like you asked," Green said, her voice steady. "And you were right. There's something off. Over the past year, Rachel has been receiving monthly deposits of $15,000, sometimes more. But the strange part is that the source is listed as a private offshore account. There's no name, no reference to who's sending the money, but it's coming from a well-established financial firm." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "An offshore account? That's not a coincidence. Do you have any idea where it's coming from?" "I've started tracing the transfers," Green replied. "The firm is based out of the Cayman Islands, but we're running into a wall because of the privacy laws. I'll need to dig deeper to get any further." Sullivan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. That money is tied to something much bigger than an affair. Rachel's getting money from someone, and I believe Robert knows more than he's telling me. We need to figure out who's behind this and why. Green nodded. "I'll continue digging, but we're getting closer." Sullivan felt a shiver of realization. The money wasn't just for Rachel. It was for something else. Something that could explain why Robert and Rachel had betrayed Lisa in such a devastating way. He had a gut feeling they were involved in something far darker than infidelity. The truth was closer than ever, but it wasn't going to be easy to uncover. The days following Sullivan's meeting with Green were filled with tension and uncertainty. The investigation had taken a darker turn, and Sullivan knew they were on the verge of uncovering something big. Something that could change everything. He felt it in his gut. Rachel's mysterious financial situation, coupled with Robert's evasive behavior, was leading them to something much more sinister than a mere affair. It was beginning to feel like the lies were just the tip of the iceberg. Sullivan knew they needed to act fast. The information Green had uncovered about Rachel's offshore accounts was troubling, but they were still in the early stages of tracing the money. And with Robert continuing to lie about his knowledge of the money, Sullivan felt like he was chasing shadows. But one thing was clear. The affair between Robert and Rachel wasn't just about sex or betrayal. It was about something much darker. Detective Green worked tirelessly over the following days, breaking down financial records, making phone calls to contacts in the banking industry, and digging deeper into Rachel's past. The walls surrounding Rachel's mysterious benefactor seemed impenetrable at first, but Green had her ways. She had spent enough time in the financial world to know how to navigate through the legal red tape, and now it was paying off. Late one evening, Green called Sullivan with a breakthrough. "Sullivan, I've got something," she said, her voice tinged with excitement, but laced with caution. "I traced the money. The offshore account was set up under a shell company, but the company is registered to someone named Lawrence Waverly. Ever heard of him?" Sullivan froze. Lawrence Waverly. He knew that name. Waverly wasn't just any name. He was a well-known businessman in the area, a wealthy investor with connections that extended far beyond Brookwood. More importantly, he was a known associate of Robert. They had worked together on a few high-profile legal cases. Sullivan had never suspected that their professional relationship had turned into something much more. Something dangerous. "No," Sullivan said, his mind racing. "Who is he? And what's his connection to Rachel?" Green's voice was steady, but there was an underlying tone of urgency. "Waverly has ties to organized crime. He's been investigated by the feds a few times, but nothing has ever stuck. He's known for laundering money through various businesses, usually under the radar. It looks like Rachel's been working with him, and if Robert's connected to him too, this just got a lot worse." Sullivan's heart sank. He had suspected there was something off about Robert and Rachel, but he never imagined it could be this dangerous. The stakes had just been raised. Is there any direct evidence linking Rachel and Waverly? Sullivan asked, already thinking ahead. Not yet, Green replied, but I'm digging into Rachel's history. I've found a few trips she took overseas in the past few years. There's a chance she's been meeting Waverly under the radar. But we need more. I'll keep pushing. Sullivan ran a hand over his face, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. This was something much bigger. He needed to find out how deep the connection between Rachel and Waverly went and what role Robert played in it. But one thing was certain. Lisa was right. There was more going on here than anyone could have imagined. The next day, Sullivan decided it was time to confront Robert again. He wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. Robert had been hiding something all along, and Sullivan was determined to get the truth out of him, no matter how far he had to push. Robert's law office was quieter than usual when Sullivan walked in. His secretary greeted him, but there was an uncomfortable tension in the air. As Sullivan made his way to Robert's office, he could sense that something was off. Robert had been under increasing pressure lately. He wasn't as composed as he had been when they first met. There was fear in his eyes now, a look Sullivan hadn't seen before. "Detective," Robert greeted him again, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. He was visibly shaken. Sullivan wasted no time. "We need to talk, Robert. I've been doing some digging, and there's something I need you to explain." Robert glanced nervously at the door, as though expecting someone to walk in at any moment. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Sullivan pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. "This is about Lawrence Waverly. I know you're involved with him. I also know about Rachel's connections to him. You've been laundering money, Robert. You've been involved in something much darker than you're letting on. I need you to come clean now." Robert's face went white. He seemed to lose his breath for a moment, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. He looked like a man who had just realized his entire world was about to come crashing down. "I don't know what you're talking about," Robert stammered. "I'm not involved in anything illegal." Sullivan's patience was wearing thin. "You're lying. I've got proof. The money transfers, the shell companies, Rachel's involvement with Waverly, none of it adds up. I don't care what you think you're protecting, Robert. I need you to tell me everything." Now Robert's hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then finally he broke. His voice was low, filled with regret. All right, I'm involved, but not in the way you think." Robert's eyes met Sullivan's, and for the first time, there was a look of complete defeat in them. "Rachel and I were working with Waverly. He was offering us something we couldn't turn down: money, power, access. But it wasn't supposed to go this far. I never wanted any of this to happen." Sullivan's mind was reeling, but he kept his composure. "How far did it go, Robert?" "Too far," Robert admitted, his voice breaking. "Rachel, she got in too deep. I tried to pull away, but she was already involved in things I couldn't control. Waverly promised us wealth, but it came at a price. I didn't think it would cost us our lives." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, Robert? What happened?" Robert hesitated, his face paling further. "Rachel, she got mixed up with Waverly in ways I didn't understand. They were laundering money, yes. But there was more. Something much worse. They were involved in human trafficking. They were using Rachel to facilitate a network of illegal operations. And when Rachel tried to back out, that's when things went wrong. She got caught up in something dangerous and someone had to die." Sullivan felt his stomach twist in disbelief. "Someone died?" Robert nodded slowly. "Yes. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. Rachel was involved in a murder. Waverly's people killed someone to cover their tracks, and Rachel tried to get away, but she was too deep, and now Waverly's after her. He's been trying to silence her ever since." The room went cold. Sullivan stood up, his mind racing. This was no longer just a case of betrayal. It was a matter of life and death. And Lisa, she was right in the middle of it. The affair, the money, the lies. They were all part of a much bigger story. One that had led to murder. Sullivan knew what he had to do next. He needed to protect Lisa, and he needed to stop Waverly before anyone else was killed. Detective Sullivan felt the weight of Robert's confession settle like a heavy fog in his mind. The realization that Rachel was involved in something as horrific as human trafficking and that Robert's betrayal had gone far beyond a mere affair sent a chill through his veins. The stakes had escalated from a broken marriage to something far darker, and Sullivan was now racing against time to stop a network of crime that had already taken lives. Rachel, once just the innocent victim of a twisted affair, was now entangled in a criminal web that she couldn't escape. And Lisa, unknowingly caught in the center of it all, was at risk. Waverly was dangerous. If he was willing to murder to cover his tracks, there was no telling how far he'd go to ensure his secret stayed buried. Sullivan felt a deep urgency rise in him. He couldn't waste time. Waverly wasn't just a businessman. He was a predator with the power to destroy lives without a second thought. It was time to act. Sullivan walked out of Robert's office in a daze, his mind racing with all the pieces of the puzzle he was trying to put together. He immediately called Green. "Green, we've got a serious situation on our hand," Sullivan said as soon as she picked up. Robert's confession wasn't just about the affair. Rachel's been involved with Lawrence Waverly's operation for months, maybe longer. She's been helping him launder money, but it's more than that. They're involved in human trafficking. Rachel tried to get out, but things went sideways. Waverly's been covering up their tracks, and now someone's dead. "Dead?" Green replied, her voice rising in shock. "Who?" "I don't know. Robert wouldn't say who it was. But what we do know is that Rachel's life is in danger now. Waverly's people are trying to silence her, and if they find out we're onto them, they won't hesitate to make Lisa their next target." Sullivan could hear the wheels turning in Green's head. She knew what this meant. "We need to move fast," Green said, her voice filled with determination. "I'll run checks on Waverly's associates. I'll see what I can dig up on his known connections. But we need to get Rachel and Lisa into protective custody now. If Waverly's connected to this, they're both in danger." Sullivan's pulse quickened. "I'll call the department. We're going to put a plan in place for Lisa, but we need to find Rachel first. She's the key to all of this." Sullivan hung up with Green and immediately contacted the local police department to arrange for Lisa and her children to be placed in protective custody. But there was one problem. They had no idea where Rachel was. She had been hiding ever since Robert's confession, and her phone had gone silent. The only trace they had was the last address she had visited, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Brookwood, one of the few properties still under Waverly's control. Sullivan's gut told him that this was where they'd find her, if they were lucky. The warehouse loomed ahead, its gray, decaying walls like a forgotten part of the town's past. Sullivan parked his car in the dirt lot, his eyes scanning the area. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty space. He could feel the tension in the air as he stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively moving to the gun holstered at his side. This wasn't just a routine search. This was dangerous. He signaled to two other officers who had joined him, and the three of them cautiously approached the door of the warehouse. As Sullivan reached for the handle, he stopped short, his ears catching a sound, a muffled thump, followed by voices. He looked at the officers. "Stay sharp," he whispered. "We're not alone." He pushed the door open slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The interior of the warehouse was dim, the only light coming from cracks in the boarded-up windows. Sullivan's eyes adjusted, and he saw figures moving in the shadows. Two men stood by a large, rusted crate, talking in low tones. But what caught Sullivan's attention was the woman tied to a chair in the center of the room. Rachel. Her face was bruised, her clothes torn. She looked up in fear as she heard the creaking of the door, her eyes wide with panic. Sullivan moved fast, gesturing for the officers to follow. The two men were too distracted to notice them, and in a blur of motion, Sullivan was on them, pulling out his gun and ordering them to the ground. "Police, don't move!" he shouted. The men froze, hands in the air, as Sullivan approached Rachel. She flinched at his touch, but he quickly cut the ropes around her wrists with his knife. "Rachel," Sullivan said softly, crouching beside her, "you're safe. We're getting you out of here." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and her voice trembled. I didn't want this. I just wanted to get out. But Waverly, he won't let me go." Sullivan helped her to her feet, looking over his shoulder to make sure the officers had the two men in custody. You're not. Take you to safety. But you need to tell me everything. Who's dead? What's going on, Rachel? She hesitated, her breath coming in quick gasps. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I was helping Waverly. I didn't know how deep it was. I thought it was just money laundering. But then they started bringing in people. Young girls, they were going to sell them. I tried to back out, but they threatened me. They said they'd hurt Lisa and her kids. They knew everything about us. Sullivan's stomach twisted in disgust. The scope of what she was describing was beyond anything he had imagined. Waverly wasn't just a businessman. He was a monster, trafficking women for profit. And he was willing to destroy anyone who got in his way, no matter how close they were. I was trying to leave, Rachel continued, but one of the girls died during the transfer. I don't know what happened, but they told me to keep quiet. I couldn't take it anymore. That's why I came here. I had to get away. But I never thought they'd find me here. Sullivan's mind was racing. The missing girl, the one who had died during the transfer, was the key. Waverly had killed to cover up the operation, and Rachel had tried to run. We're getting you out of here, Sullivan said firmly, leading her toward the exit. We've got a plan in motion. You're going into protective custody, and you'll help us take Waverly down. As Sullivan and Rachel stepped outside the warehouse, he could already hear the sound of sirens in the distance. Backup was on the way, and they would escort Rachel to a safe house. But Sullivan knew this was just the beginning. Waverly wouldn't stop until everyone who knew about him was gone, and Rachel wasn't the only one at risk. Lisa's life was still in danger. Sullivan called Green on his way to the safe house, his mind focused on the task ahead. Green, we've got Rachel. She's safe. But now we need to move fast. Waverly's not going to let this go. We need to get to Lisa. He'll come after her next. Green's voice was tight with urgency. I've already got a team mobilizing. We'll make sure she's safe. Just keep your head down. We're in this together, Sullivan. We're going to take Waverly down. Sullivan nodded grimly. The clock was ticking. They had a murderer to catch and a woman's life to save. Sullivan's heart raced as he pulled his car into the parking lot of the safe house. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as his thoughts churned. Waverly was a dangerous man, and now he was cornered. He'd stopped at nothing to protect his empire, including resorting to murder and manipulation. But now, with Rachel in protective custody and the full weight of the investigation bearing down on him, Sullivan felt a flicker of hope. They were closer than ever to bringing Waverly to justice. Still, Sullivan knew that there was a long road ahead. He had no illusions about how this would play out. Waverly wasn't going to go down quietly, and everyone involved in this case, from Rachel and Robert to Lisa and the officers working with him, was at risk. The clock was ticking, and he needed to act quickly. The safe house was an unassuming two-story building on the outskirts of town, tucked away behind a cluster of trees. Sullivan had made sure it was well secured, and the officers stationed there were some of the most trusted in the department. Lisa had been moved there earlier that morning, and while it was the safest option available, Sullivan knew that the danger was far from over. Inside the house, Rachel was sitting at a small table, her face drawn and tired. But there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. She was safe, at least for the moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of coffee, but she seemed to be regaining some semblance of calm after days of fear. Sullivan stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. Rachel looked up at him, her eyes still clouded with fear. "I'm scared. I've seen what Waverly is capable of. I can't help but feel like he's going to find me, find Lisa, and finish what he started." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm so sorry for everything. I never wanted to drag anyone into this." Sullivan placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "You're safe now, Rachel, and so is Lisa. We're going to stop him." She nodded, but Sullivan could see the doubt in her eyes. It was hard to blame her. Waverly had orchestrated this entire operation with precision, and as long as he was out there, no one was truly safe. But Sullivan wasn't about to let him get away with it. Not after everything that had happened. Sullivan took a deep breath, his mind shifting back to the case. I need you to tell me everything about Waverly's operation, Rachel. We've got to dismantle it, piece by piece. The more information we have, the better chance we have of catching him. Rachel's face darkened. It's not just money laundering and trafficking. He's got connections everywhere. Politicians, law enforcement, even some of the higher-ups in the criminal world. He's built a network that's almost impossible to penetrate. But I know who some of his key people are. People who are helping him keep this all going. If you want to take him down, we need to start there. Sullivan nodded. This was the break he had been waiting for. They weren't just dealing with a businessman turned criminal. Waverly had created a web of corruption that spanned far beyond Brookwood, touching places Sullivan hadn't even considered. But with Rachel's help, they now had the inside information they needed. Meanwhile, Green and the rest of the team were working tirelessly to gather more intel on Waverly's associates. They had already started surveilling some of the known contacts that Rachel had named, hoping to catch them in the act or find evidence that could tie them directly to the trafficking ring. The next few hours were crucial. If they moved too slowly, Waverly could escape, and that was something they couldn't afford to let happen. Sullivan called Green to check in. How's it going on your end? He asked. We've got something, Green replied, her voice tight with urgency. One of Waverly's men just made a call to a known smuggler in the city. We think they're setting up a shipment tonight. We're going to move in on it, but we need backup. If this is what we think it is, Waverly's operation is still very much active. Sullivan's stomach churned. This was it. They were on the verge of catching Waverly red-handed. I'm on my way, Sullivan said, hanging up the phone. He turned to Rachel one last time before leaving. Stay here. We'll be back soon. Just stay calm. The hours leading up to the operation were filled with tension. Sullivan and his team, along with federal agents who had been brought in to help, prepared for the bust. The smuggling operation had been traced to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city, another one of Waverly's properties. It was clear that this was no ordinary trafficking ring. This was part of a far-reaching, well-organized network that spanned multiple states. As they approached the warehouse in unmarked cars, Sullivan's thoughts were focused on one thing: getting to Waverly before he had a chance to flee. There was no way he was going to let this man slip through his fingers. They arrived at the warehouse, a dilapidated building surrounded by a tall fence, its rusted gates barely hanging on their hinges. Sullivan gave the signal to his team, and they began to move in, surrounding the perimeter with tactical precision. Remember, Sullivan murmured to his team over the radio, we're looking for Waverly, his associates, and any evidence of trafficking, but don't underestimate how dangerous these people are. Watch your backs. They moved quickly, scaling the side of the building and breaking through the back door. Inside, the warehouse was dark and smelled of mildew, but they didn't have time to worry about the surroundings. They had a job to do. The team split up, sweeping the building floor by floor. The sounds of footsteps echoed in the silence, but there was no sign of Waverly or his men. Then a voice echoed from the upper level. It's a trap! Move! Sullivan's heart stopped for a moment. A flash of movement on the balcony above caught his attention, and he ran toward the stairs, gun raised. As he reached the top, he saw him. Lawrence Waverly was standing by a large shipping container, a cold smile on his face. He didn't look like a man cornered. He looked like a man who knew he was in control. You really think you can stop me? Waverly sneered, his voice dripping with venom. You're too late, Sullivan. I've already won. Sullivan's grip tightened on his weapon. Not this time, Waverly. Without warning, Waverly reached into his jacket, pulling out a small gun. A shot rang out, echoing through the warehouse. Sullivan dove for cover, narrowly avoiding the bullet that slammed into the wall behind him. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping as he returned fire. The chaos of the moment unfolded quickly. The sound of gunfire, shouts, and the scramble of feet moving across concrete. Sullivan knew this was his chance. He darted forward, using the cover of the shelves to close the distance. Waverly's smug expression faltered for a moment, realizing that he was being hunted, but it was too late. Sullivan reached the balcony, and with a quick motion, he disarmed Waverly, pinning him to the ground. Waverly struggled, but Sullivan had the upper hand. "It's over," he said, breathing heavily. "You're done." The team closed in, securing the area and apprehending Waverly's associates. Sullivan stood above the man who had caused so much pain, his breath heavy but steady. Hours later, as the sun began to rise over Brookwood, Sullivan sat at his desk, looking through the evidence they had gathered. Waverly was in custody, and his empire was collapsing. Rachel was safe. Lisa was safe. The children were safe. And the victims of the trafficking ring would finally have a chance at justice. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, letting out a sigh of relief. It was over, but he knew the scars of this case would remain. For Rachel, for Lisa, and for the town of Brookwood. He'd done his job, but some cases stayed with you forever.